Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Sims, and I'm the Manager of Continuing Education here at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you all for joining us today for Open Classroom. Open Classroom is our free webinar series housed within the Professional Development Office. We also offer a lot of other workshop, certificate, and continuing education courses. If you are looking for continuing education units or just want to dig deeper into topics, I encourage you to check out our offerings. You can go to brownschool.edu/professional-development. The QR code that you see on your screen can also take you to that website. I'll also be dropping it in the chat as well. All right, so just a brief housekeeping information, and then we will start with our program. So this is a Zoom webinar format, which means that you cannot turn your camera or mic on, but you can use the chat. The settings are set so that you can either chat with just the hosts and panelists, or you can chat with everybody who's watching this webinar today. And we do encourage you to use the chat. There will be time for Q&A at the end, and the way that you can post your questions is by doing so in the chat. You don't need to wait until the end to do that. You can post them at any time during the presentation. And lastly, this program will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel and also to our Open Classroom site, brownschool.wustl.edu/open-classroom. I'll put a link to that in the chat as well. The recordings are usually posted within 24 hours. So you can browse that to find probably tomorrow. So with that, we are ready to introduce our speaker in the program today. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Lucan, who's the Associate Director of Admissions and Recruitment for the Brown School. Sarah?
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all for being here. A special welcome to prospective Brown School students. We're very glad you're here. I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to the third installment of our Curriculum Showcase series on Open Classroom. And I'd like to thank Sarah and the Brown School Professional Development team for partnering with admissions to bring this great series to our prospective students and the community. What we hope that you will gain from this Open Classroom is a little more knowledge about the topic being discussed, which is who benefits from tax breaks in St. Louis. And for prospective students, we want you to get a sense of what you can expect in the classroom with the renowned faculty members who are being featured in this series. Today's session specifically offers a sample of the type of issues addressed by our social work-related curriculum, particularly the domestic social and economic development concentration in the Master of Social Work program. I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, Molly Metzger. She is a senior lecturer at the Brown School and serves as chair for the Domestic Social and Economic Development concentration within the Master of Social Work program. She is also a faculty director at the Center for Social Development and a faculty fellow at the Gephardt Institute for Civic and Community Engagement. Metzger's research focuses on local, state, and federal housing policies, examining how these policies often reproduce patterns of segregation. She strives to build and share research with a host of community partners in order to move housing policy toward the goals of racial equity and economic justice. Metzger's major projects have included a community-based participatory research project on public housing preservation in Chicago, a national analysis of the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, and a collaboration with the St. Louis Housing Authority in which she and her team interviewed Section 8 renters about their housing preferences. She is also an active board member at the Metro St. Louis Equal Housing and Opportunity Council. And finally, Molly earned her PhD from Northwestern University. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Molly for our session today.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks for everyone joining this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I want to say a couple just quick framing remarks before I get into the presentation. I will be talking about who benefits from tax breaks and specifically around property taxes today in St. Louis. But if you're not in St. Louis, you still might be interested in this topic because this is an issue that affects cities all over the country and There's an organization called Good Jobs First that's done a lot of research on this topic. So if this is interesting to you, but you're like, oh, how does this play out in my city? If you live in the United States, you might want to check out their research as well. So TLDR, too long didn't read. In other words, in a nutshell, this is what I'm going to be talking about today. If we love public schools, we should care about property taxes. I'll be sharing with you up front some of my motivation, but I think there's actually a good number of reasons why we should be caring about this issue of property taxes and tax breaks. Local property taxes comprise about 2/3 of our St. Louis public schools budget. So anything that affects our property tax base has a huge impact on our school budget. To answer the question, who benefits from property tax breaks? It's honestly the entities that need these tax breaks the least. Wealthy corporations, wealthy nonprofits, and wealthy homeowners, as well as a lot of people who are in the business of real estate development. So that could be real estate developers, real estate lawyers. And when our city gives tax breaks that are not needed, our village suffers. So my big question is, how can we foster community and economic development that helps, not hurts, our most vulnerable children, youth, and families? And I'll close with some progress that we're building on, but I'll say, people who care about public schools, we need you at the table even more than you are now. And I think there's a lot of good progress to build on. All right, so I'm going to start with my motivation. Public schools matter. They offer free education to all our children. They can be community hubs. I know I'll show you a picture of my family on the next slide. Our neighborhood school is definitely a community hub. And our elected school boards are an important part of our democracy. And I think a lot of people are in agreement right now that our democracy is facing some very serious challenges. And so it's really important that we all figure out how to strengthen it and bolster it. And I think public schools are part of that. And full disclosure, I'm a public school parent. So this is a picture of my family and our kindergarten students' elementary school. And so this is not just sort of an academic thought exercise for me, but this is really something that is very, very close to my heart, thinking about what our kids need and how we can make sure that every kid has what they need. And there is a history of racist policies. This is policies within the realm of housing, education, and other policies, wealth hoarding. So again, people making decisions to benefit their own families, especially white people, wealthier people, that have created the segregation and inequality specifically that our schools are now facing. And I would argue that the school choice movement is actually part of that as well, that we have this stratification, this very separate set of opportunities within, for instance, the city of St. Louis. And so as a result of all of that, our public school district, St. Louis Public Schools, or SLPS for short, has the highest concentration of low income and unhoused students, and particularly students of color. So when we show up for St. Louis Public Schools, it benefits all of us and is a matter of racial and economic justice. And if you are newer to this history, I added a couple books here that you might be interested in checking out that get sort of at the intersection of housing policy and economic development and education policy. In terms of the housing side of things, more than 4,000 St. Louis public school students are unhoused or unstably housed. And this comprises more than 1 out of 5 students. And they range the gamut from elementary school through high school, as well as other types of schools or programs. So we have students who are in hospitals. We have students who are in residential schools. And what do I mean when I say unhoused or unstably housed? So these are kids and families who have been formally identified as unhoused under the McKinney-Vento Act, which is our federal policy that establishes education rights for kids who either are unhoused in the sense that they're staying in a homeless shelter or some kind of temporary housing like that, or maybe they have, a roof over their head, they're staying in a house, but it's not theirs. So they're doubled up with other families. They're couch surfing. With our older students, some of them are adulting, as some people say, living on their own, maybe in conditions that aren't meant for human habitation. So vacant buildings, cars, things like that. So there are all different kinds of situations that our students are in. And there are many more students beyond this 4,000 that have housing insecurity, meaning their households, their families are spending a lot of their income, maybe half their income on their housing costs, or that they're living in low quality housing that might have lead or mold, things like that. So there are all kinds of housing issues, and these students living in these conditions are really concentrated in St. Louis public schools as compared to our other school districts. And this is a map created by recent Brown School alum. Congratulations to Sophia Scott, who just graduated from the DSED program here at the Brown School. She made this map showing where our unhoused or unstably housed SLPS students are attending school. And those who know St. Louis know that we are a very divided city. But this map was interesting to me because it shows that even though there are certainly concentrations of unhoused students in the kind of north and south parts of the city in specific zip codes, it's really affecting schools all over the city. And so what does this mean for those of us? Maybe we're parents with an SLPS, maybe we're teachers, maybe we're social workers working in a St. Louis public school. It means that our students, our kids, our youth are bouncing around constantly. St. Louis Public Schools has a 34% mobility rate as of the last available statistics, which means that a third of our kids are not spending the school year in the same school building. They're entering late, they're exiting early, they might be attending multiple schools throughout the year. There's been some research on this. A big part of it is housing instability. And it also leads to attendance issues. And what I want to connect this to is that it's not just about statistics, it's not just about test scores or something like that, but it's about the village that we are trying to build. It's about our community. And Mindy Fullilove is a psychiatrist who's used the term root shock. And so it's a metaphor that comes out of botany to describe what happens to a plant when it is uprooted, and what a shock that is, and how hard it is to grow and develop when you are consistently being pulled up by the roots. And so I think this is a really apt metaphor for our community. We're a community in root shock where there's constant transition, and we are trying to build relationships. We're trying to support our students. We're trying to educate our students, but they might only be in our classroom or in our school for a week or two or a month or two. And so there's a real instability that we're trying to work through here, and we need to find solutions for this. So that's a big part of my motivation. And I also want to say, you might have very different motivations and still be interested in this topic of tax breaks. So for instance, the Show Me Institute is a libertarian think tank in the state of Missouri, the Show Me State, and they have been a very active entity on this topic of tax breaks. Or we have former State Representative Mike Moon, who introduced a bill to tax our wealthiest nonprofit institutions. So sometimes, in politics, we have strange bedfellows. So even if you're not necessarily a public school person, you might still care about this issue from a point of view of government transparency, fiscal responsibility, or just basic fairness. So that's my motivation. So before I get into the property tax issues, I'm going to do a little school budget 101. Some people think that the school budget is part of the city's budget, but it's actually not. St. Louis Public Schools is its own taxing jurisdiction with its own budget. And that budget is overwhelmingly reliant on local property taxes. So in terms of our real estate taxes and other property taxes, they comprise about 2/3 of our school budget. And on the flip side, 63 of our taxes go to St. Louis Public Schools. So when we're giving out tax breaks, that affects other entities as well. The city is affected, the library system is affected, but schools are affected the most. And while we do have other revenue sources for the schools, such as bond issues and some state and federal funds, For a variety of reasons, those they're not making up the difference. They're a minority of our revenue stream. So our local property taxes really matter a lot in terms of what we have to work with in serving our students. And what do we need money for? Some people, I think it's a pretty fair question people often ask. Well, what would we spend money on? One is our staff, the people, right? This is a predominantly social work audience. So what are social workers getting paid? Is that a competitive wage? Can we not just attract, but also retain social workers? And then of course, teachers, literacy specialists that are available at some schools and not other schools, right? And all the other important staff in our school buildings. We have building maintenance. We have beautiful old historic buildings in St. Louis, and they are very difficult to maintain. We have more than $350 million in unmet capital needs, and this is just in our buildings that are operating. So this doesn't even take into account the fact that we are still owning, the school district, still own empty buildings that are no longer in use as schools. Just in our operating schools, more than $350 million. We still have lead contamination in many of our schools. We could use the money for an expansion of our wraparound services. So this is, proactive social services, social work that is helping students connect to resources in the community to get what they need to learn, right? Because it can't all be on teachers' shoulders. It's really unfair to expect teachers to cover every need, but students need support getting connected to all those other things that they need. So right now we only have wraparound services at what are considered our full service St. Louis public schools. So we could expand wraparound services to really every school, as well as busing issues. If there are any other St. Louis public school parents on the call, what a mess we're in with our transportation, as well as food is an issue that's often brought up. So again, we need these property taxes to fund these things that all our students need. So how is our property tax revenue being stewarded? I'm going to talk about two big issues. One is tax abatement, and the other one is the issue of tax-exempt nonprofits. So I'll start with abatement. What are tax incentives? Tax incentives are local. They actually can operate at other levels as well. There are state tax incentives and other types of tax incentives. But today I'll be talking about our local property tax breaks given to specific housing and business developments. And in St. Louis and in many other cities, the two largest programs are tax abatement, and there are different types of tax abatement programs, and tax increment financing, also known as TIF. And the logic behind these programs is that they will encourage housing and business development that could not happen without the incentives. And often, though, when we're actually, sort of playing out in real life, these programs, these tax breaks go to politically connected real estate developers that are in the wealthier parts of town that don't necessarily need a tax break in order to make that new housing or that new business development or that new mixed use development viable. So these tax breaks add up. Again, just in terms of motivation to learn more, to stick with me with all of this jargon and all of this, sort of wonky policy talk, it really adds up. So in the last year in which data were available, $32 million were diverted from the St. Louis Public Schools budget through these two largest tax incentive programs, tax abatement and TIF. So again, to put this into perspective, a typical budget for an entire school for an entire year is $2 million. So, I'll leave it to the audience to think about all the things that we could do with $32 million in our schools. So what is it? I'm going to talk about tax abatement first here. So I'm going to explain first, how does property taxation work without tax abatement? So our property taxes, for those of us who are homeowners, are based on the assessed value of our house. The city assessor every 2 years updates their estimate of what they think the market value, the real value of our house is. And then taxes are assessed as a function of that. So I believe this is up to date, about $8.26 per $100 of assessed value. So for example, if I own a $180,000 home, if that's what it's assessed at, I'm sorry, if that's what it's appraised at, I mix those terms, but if it's appraised at 180, the assessed value will be 19% of that. So $34,000 or so. And then the taxes levied on that would be about $2,800. So it's not unusual for homeowners to be spending $3,000 or more on property taxes per year. If you have a property tax abatement, it means that your taxes are frozen at some point in time for a period of up to 25 years. And it could be 10 years of 100% abatement, meaning that your taxes remain frozen at a low rate for 10 years, or 50% abatement for the next 15 years, meaning that you're only paying 50% of the new taxes for that period. And this could be to build new construction, new housing, or to rehab an existing building. So I'm going to break it down a little bit more. Let's say there's a part of town where there's a lot of vacant land. That vacant land has value, right? And whoever owns that land should be paying property taxes based on the value of the land. If a tax abatement is approved, it means that the taxes will be frozen at the value of that land, even if a new home is constructed and the value goes up by $300,000. That owner will still be paying taxes as if it's still a vacant lot. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. So this is it's a tool for housing and economic development. And it's a tool that can be used well, and it's a tool that can be used poorly. So in my opinion, this is a positive example of the use of tax abatement. These are homes built by Habitat for Humanity in the Tiffany neighborhood of South St. Louis. They sold, coming on 10 years ago, to $150,000 to low-income buyers, and they got tax abatement for 10 years. So again, this was tax abatement being used to bring the overall cost of home ownership down, and Habitat for Humanity works with their buyers so that they know, hey, when the tax abatement expires, you're going to have this new payment that's due, and they will help to prepare their buyers for that. But I think that this is an appropriate use of tax abatement. But in general, unfortunately, over the last 10, 15 years, tax abatement has been used overwhelmingly in stronger market areas. So not areas where there's large amounts of vacancy, but areas, again, for those who know St. Louis, like the Hill, Forest Park Southeast, Shaw, parts of town that are doing relatively well compared to the rest of the city. And they're used by wealthy and well-connected developers. And so this was an article from several years ago from Jeanette Cooperman shining a light on some of the really worst offenses in terms of high value properties, wealthy homeowners who have the political connections to get very, very low property taxes. A couple more recent examples. This is a new apartment development, a luxury development in the Soulard neighborhood. Again, for those who don't know St. Louis, Soulard is a neighborhood famous for its Mardi Gras. It has beautiful homes, a lot of historic preservation. It is a very stable neighborhood in St. Louis. There is not a lot of vacancy. It's close to downtown. And yet, developers of this property got 100% tax abatement for 10 years. They turned around and sold the property for $36 million. And with tax abatement, whoever buys the property gets to enjoy that tax abatement. So it gets passed to the next buyer. And this is for, very expensive apartments in a very wealthy part of town. Another example is on the 4300 block of Hunt. This is in the Forest Park Southeast neighborhood. Again, very much in the footprint of, WashU and the medical center, or I should say in the vicinity. These are properties, I think either one or both are short-term rentals or Airbnbs. also got 100% tax abatement for 10 years. So these properties, again, very high value properties in a very economically strong part of town, are only contributing about $70 a year in property taxes. So these are maps of where our incentives are used, and you can see that they're used all over the city, but specifically in the map on the left around, you can see the sort of middle part of town. This is what we call our central corridor, sort of the near south side. And you can just see how rampant the use of tax abatement has been. TIF, I'm not going to get into in this talk today, but it's a similar program. It's typically used for larger developments, and it's even more clustered in that central corridor of our city. And again, these incentives really add up, $32 million a year that could potentially be going to the schools. And it's not just within the city. So for instance, the Centene Corporation's expansion in Clayton, just west of St. Louis City, got a massive tax abatement for their economic expansion. Their total incentive package was worth about $147 million. So not trying to say that this is only an issue with the city of St. Louis by any stretch. So how does it all work? Who decides who gets tax abatement? The basic structure of our city government, we have a 3-member board called E&A, or the Board of Estimate and Apportionment. And this is, again, it's different from other cities. I'm from Chicago originally. We have sort of a more strong mayor system. This is a little unusual, where we have the mayor and then the president of the Board of Aldermen. So the Board of Aldermen is what is our legislative body. Other cities might call that the city council. We call it the Board of Aldermen or the Board of Alders. So the president of that board is part of E&A, and then the comptroller, who is the chief financial officer. And it's basically the Board of Aldermen, so the legislative body, as well as ultimately the mayor, working on these tax abatements in partnership with a quasi-governmental body called the St. Louis Development Corporation, or SLDC. So this is a corporation that is quasi-governmental, so it's a bit of a strange body. It doesn't always comply with all the same rules of a typical governmental entity, but the leadership is appointed by the mayor. So there is some democratic accountability, but there are a series of review boards underneath SLDC where proposals for tax abatement or TIF will be reviewed working with SLDC staff. So for tax abatement, typically the developer works with the alderperson in their ward. So we have 14 wards in the city of St. Louis. It used to be 28, now we're down to, we voted to reduce that to 14 wards. So typically, if a real estate developer sees a piece of property and they want to build something new or redevelop something, they work with the alderperson and with St. Louis Development Corporation staff to negotiate a proposal. SLDC has a formal review process. It is still being developed and changed, and there's been some progress, but there needs to be more. I'll leave it at that for now. The proposal then, if it is continued, if the alderperson introduces a bill to grant this tax abatement, that's reviewed by a board called LCRA, the Land Clearance for Redevelopment Authority. And if it passes through LCRA, then it moves to the Board of Aldermen and it moves through the legislative process there. So it gets a first reading in front of the entire Board of Aldermen. Again, if it continues to move, the president gets to decide how to assign that bill to a committee. Typically, these bills go to HUDS, which is the Housing, Urban Development and Zoning Committee. And this is a really good committee to keep your eye on if this is an issue that you're concerned about. See what bills are moving in the HUDS committee. And you can see if you just Google the city and the Board of Aldermen, you can look at the different committees and you can look at the calendar and the agendas for what's going into HUDS. If it gets passed by that committee, it goes back to the full Board of Aldermen, the 28-person board, for a series of votes, and ultimately goes to the mayor, who can sign it or veto it. So that's tax abatement. The next issue I wanted to talk about is the tax exemption that's enjoyed by nonprofits. Again, this is not unique to St. Louis, but it's really an issue in any city, especially our sort of post-industrial cities, a lot of Midwestern cities that are really over-reliant on nonprofits as sort of anchor institutions. So I'll say a little bit more about what I mean. A lot of our land in the city of St. Louis is owned by nonprofits. So this was a map done by our planning agency at the city with Scott Ogilvie back in 2018. And it showed that 40% of real estate in our city is either government owned, so that would not bring in taxes, or tax exempt. And you can see in red, this is all the property that at that point was held by nonprofit institutions. And so often we'll call these EDs and MEDs, or education and medical institutions. So typically larger nonprofit organizations. Some people call them mega nonprofits to kind of differentiate them from the smaller nonprofits that are, working with smaller budgets and don't have the wealth of the big universities and the big medical centers. So again, like I said, especially in our post-industrial cities, these institutions, like where I am right now at Washington University, are some of the largest employers and property owners in the city. And because they're nonprofits, they are tax exempt. So nonprofits do not need to pay real estate taxes. If a nonprofit purchases land that was previously generating property taxes, those property taxes are sort of removed from our tax base. And there's a recent book by DeVarian Baldwin called In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower that talks about some of these dynamics and looks at sort of a wide range of cities across the United States to look at the relationships between EDs and MEDs and the cities where they're located. So in many cities, however, our EDs and MEDs, our mega nonprofits, are paying their fair share. So in some cities, mega nonprofits contribute to city or school budgets, and it can happen in a number of different ways. Sometimes it's because of a tax that's been passed. So in the state of California, they have excise taxes. They have taxes on university endowments. So the bank accounts that universities use, they don't spend that money, but they invest it. And then the money that is made off of those investments is used to pay for the university's costs. So it could happen through taxes, or it could happen through, and I say voluntary arrangements, voluntaries in quotes, because often it's after there's been an organized campaign making a demand that these nonprofits pay their fair share. So these pictures are from a successful campaign in Philadelphia. Pen for Pilots was asking the University of Pennsylvania for $40 million a year to help get lead and asbestos out of their public schools. And they did get a commitment from Penn, but it was after really a protracted struggle and campaign. And this chart shows, what some of our peer institutions are committing in what's called pilots. So nonprofits don't have to pay taxes, but they might pay payments in lieu of taxes, so pilots. You can see in the second column, it shows sort of the size of the university endowments. So again, ranging from $7 billion at Brown to more than $50 billion at Harvard. And there are sort of unique dynamics in all of the cities in which these universities are located that have resulted in some kind of pilots agreement. And it's an ongoing battle. It's not, the universities aren't always paying what they promised to pay, but one way or another, they are contributing to their cities and schools. Washington University has a greater than $12 billion endowment. At this point, we are not making any kind of payments through pilots or anything like that, nor are the other EDs and MEDs in St. Louis. And I want to also underscore that this is not just the universities. So in a lot of other cities, this is just an example from Boston. It's also the medical nonprofits as well as larger cultural institutions that are contributing pilots. So for instance, in the city of Boston, their educational institutions are contributing about $15 million a year, but their medical institutions are contributing about $20 million a year. And their cultural nonprofits are contributing almost $500,000 a year. So this is not just a university issue, but could come into play with a lot of different large nonprofit entities. So the takeaway, it's unusual that St. Louis's wealthy eds and meds do not contribute pilots to our public schools. So I'm going to share a little good news, and then I would love to see what questions and comments there are. I haven't been able to keep an eye on the chat during the presentation, so I'm excited to see what kind of conversation is going on. So here's some good news. Recently, there's been a lot of incentive use for affordable housing. So we haven't seen sort of the quantity of tax abatement proposals for luxury or higher end developments. When I started researching this and talking about this 10 years ago, it was just, when you looked at every HUD's agenda, it was just bill after bill of tax abatements, and they would just kind of pass through almost like a rubber stamp. It's not like that right now. So the tax abatement proposals that we're seeing do tend to be more often for affordable housing. So this is a proposed development, a proposed and planned development. It's been awarded low-income housing tax credits and tax abatement for low-income senior housing in Benton Park. And there's also development happening without local tax incentives. And sometimes it happens with other types of incentives like historic tax credits at the state or federal level. But these on the left side, it's the Masonic Temple that is now leasing up and it has been rehabbed. On the right side is a building very close to where I live that they're just starting the rehab. But these are both moving forward without any local tax abatement. So this is great news for our schools. Some other good news, there are policy reforms that are either in the works or that have been accomplished. So last year, the Board of Aldermen passed Board Bill 64 that increased the structure around public engagement and government transparency in the use of tax abatement and TIF. And it gives a bit of a stronger role to the schools in reviewing developments. There's still some work that needs to be ironed out. There's talk about how do we really implement this most effectively, but I think it's a step in the right direction. Just recently, my alderwoman Alicia Saunier introduced Board Bill 198, which is a requirement that if you're applying for tax incentives like tax abatement, you have to be current with your existing taxes. It's a pretty low bar. But you'd be surprised what some of these developers are trying to do. So that's a good check. Also in my ward, we're working on a 7th Ward development scorecard so that beyond the review that's already in place through the St. Louis Development Corporation, we can talk about what type of specifically housing our neighborhood needs, because the needs in one ward might be different than the needs in another ward. The needs in one part of the ward might be different than the needs in a different part of the ward. So what sort of development do we want to see? Is there, for instance, is it all studio bedrooms and studio apartments and 1 bedrooms, or do we have enough space to house our families? If we're talking about affordable housing, well, affordable for whom? How affordable? What are the actual rents? And what is the process that will guarantee that those apartments are going to the people who actually need those lower rents? So all of that is being deliberated, and I think this conversation is really healthy, and it's a lot to build on. And it's not a good time to rest. It's a time that I think more sustained advocacy could be really effective. So on the St. Louis Public Schools side, we have the Parent Action Council, which is basically like a district-wide PTO. We have a new committee that's focused on housing and incentives. Our teachers union has been talking about this issue of tax incentives and the abuse of tax incentives for years. They're about to hold a convening, providing some new data from Good Jobs First. The People's Plan St. Louis is a coalition of organizations also been talking about these issues for a long time, and they are in the process of sort of regrouping and relaunching their vision, as well as DSA St. Louis has talked about the need for pilots both in the city as well as in University City. So I think this is all a lot of people power that we need to build off of. So I'm often asked, okay, so like, what should I do if I'm someone who cares about this? If you're a St. Louisan, well, maybe learn more. And I'm not going to give any advice besides, get to know your own neighborhood. Do you have a neighborhood association, a community development corporation, or some other group that is already weighing in this process? Who sits at those tables? What do they value? How do they define good development? Who's your alderperson? What ward do you live in? What is your alderperson's perspective on tax incentives? Are they asking the hard questions, or are they rubber stamping? So, getting to know your own neighborhood is a great place to start, as well as getting connected with me. I'm so happy to give this talk again, or to go into detail on other parts that I wasn't able to focus on today. So I often talk about the tax increment financing side of things, or TIF. We're not using that tool as much recently, so I took it out for today. But if your group wanted to learn about TIF, I'd be happy to come talk about TIF, or to talk more about how a bill becomes a law, or how the politics of this all can play out. So you can Google me, and I'm easy to reach. There's also a number of organizations that I mentioned that are active on social media who you could follow to learn more. I do want to say, I know that one of our target audiences for this webinar is prospective students. So I wanted to shine a light on the fact that a lot of the entities that I've mentioned are practicum sites for our MSW students. So the St. Louis Public Schools Office for Students in Transition is essentially what we call our office that provides support for unhoused or insecurely housed students, or students who are in foster care. So they are a practicum site, and they've been a great sort of renewed partnership. A lot of our students are interested in policy-related work, and it's very exciting for them to move into the public sector. So we have students who have gone to work in the office of the mayor, the office of this was supposed to say the president of the St. Louis Board of Aldermen, as well as other advocacy organizations. So Arch City Defenders, for instance, is one of the conveners of the People's Plan. That's a very popular practicum site. Other policy-focused advocates, and then the community development corporations that are doing a lot of the affordable housing work around town. Groups like DeSales and Dutchtown South Community Corporation are often practicum sites as well. And before I close, I just want to say how important I think it is that we have more social workers and people with sort of values that are aligned with social work in these conversations. It's really complicated trying to understand what all of these funky tax tools are, and what these acronyms mean, and who decides what. It's really complicated. And again, when I first moved to St. Louis about 11 years ago, I would try to follow these hearings, and it seemed like the only people in the conversation were either the elected officials or the people that were making money off of the deals. So the developers and their lawyers predominantly, and maybe some, planning consultants and people like that. And if anyone else showed up to one of these hearings, it felt sort of strange. And that is changing. We have new voices in this conversation. And I think social workers, especially social workers who are interested in macro practice, so sort of like system level change, policy change, can be really well positioned to be sort of a bridge between entities like the schools or neighborhoods who are really affected by development decisions and tax breaks, and the people in power who are making these decisions. And so it's really exciting to me to see social workers sort of getting involved at all, from all angles of this. And if there are prospective students on the call who want to learn more, also please feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'd be happy to chat about this some more. And last but not least, this is kind of funny. It changed my emoji there, but just want to say thanks to friends at the Parent Action Council. I got some really, really helpful feedback on an earlier version of this talk. So thanks to my fellow parents. Thanks to Jerry Connolly, who has taught me so much about how this all works. And I've been talking about this issue for a long time, and a lot of friends and colleagues have helped along the way to help me understand how things get done. So I think that's it. With that, I'm happy to take any questions. I see a lot in the chat. I'm afraid to look.
There's a lot in the chat. Don't worry, I've been keeping track, and a lot of really good conversation. Lots of folks who have children at St. Louis Public Schools saying hello. So it's really nice to see that conversation here as well. So one of the first questions that we received, and actually folds into a question that I personally have too. Are there efforts to shift away from local property taxes as the basis for school budgets? And I'm kind of curious, how common is it for public schools to be funded so heavily by property taxes? If there are other cities that have budget models that look a little different, that could be more effective.
Yeah, so honestly, I am not aware of any movement in that direction. I mean, we have passed, we'll pass bond issues from time to time, which is also a local way, right, of supporting public schools. But in terms of, like, for instance, state or federal funding, honestly, I would love to see it personally. And I'm sure that there are entities that are working on it, but I think the battle is more about protecting what we have, because there are already, for the coming legislative session in our state capital here in Missouri, there's more momentum around privatizing public education, taking money out of the public schools and putting it into charter programs or voucher programs. And so it's not that we don't care about state funding, we do, and we need it. But the battle is more about protecting what we have as opposed to really expanding it in the state at this time. Doesn't mean that's how it has to be, but that's kind of where we're at as far as I know.
That makes sense. And another question about just wondering the difference between full service and non-full service schools. What percentage of schools go to full service? Are there any ethnic or racial differences across those schools?
Yeah, so, and this is really something that I am just starting to learn about, so I don't want to speak to that and get it wrong, but I can promise it's a question that I share as well. So if you wouldn't mind, Sarah, seeing who asked that, I could follow up with them, or maybe I could put it in the comments on the YouTube posting so that I get the answer to that one right. That's a great question.
Yep. That was from Jacob. And then there was also just some conversation around how big the St. Louis public school budget is. Some folks weighed in on that, and you might have mentioned that in one of your slides too, the size of the budget.
Yeah, I think, okay, now I'm afraid to get it wrong, but I want to say it's about 300 million.
Yeah.
And if there's anyone on here, I know there are a lot of people here, I'm looking at the chat now that knows better than me, please correct me if I'm wrong. But I think it's about 300 million.
Yeah.
And it's also really complicated, right? I mean, it's complicated. So that's their school budget, but we also have the St. Louis Public Schools Foundation. And then we also have PTOs who are putting in, it's probably a drop in the bucket, but there are a number of different ways in which money flows. But in terms of just like the typical budget, I think it's about in the ballpark of 300 million.
And then someone did share a link to St. Louis Public Schools website, so I'll link that back again so folks can refer to that in the chat. Yet another question. What are the potential implications of Sonier's proposed tax accountability bill, if you know anything about that? Yeah, so I assume that the tax accountability bill, I think that's Board Bill 198, where you're basically the developers that are applying for tax breaks, that we are holding them accountable to their existing tax obligations. So basically, if you're already behind on your taxes, we're not going to reward you for that behavior. So I think that the implications are that we're basically setting a higher bar for the type of development that we are incentivizing, because it's not just about the buildings, right? It's about who controls our city and who we're doing business with. And honestly, I'm not the first person to say this, but a lot of people talk about St. Louis as
having a low self-esteem as a city. We talk a lot about our problems. We've lost a lot of population. That is certainly true. We have a lot of problems as a city, and I live in the city and I experience them also. And we also have a lot of growth in this city, especially in the central corridor. So we are not losing population from the entire city. The central corridor is growing in population. We're losing a lot of kids. We're losing a lot of families of color. We're losing a lot of people on the north side and in some south side neighborhoods. But we also have a lot of strengths. We have a lot of new investment. I mean, I love it here. I'm in Chicago and I'm not going back. I'm here to stay. And a lot of people I know feel that way too, whether or not they're from St. Louis. And so I think part of this is a long answer to a short question, but I think part of this, tax accountability bill is saying, like, we know that we're a good place, actually. A lot of St. Louis, maybe all of St. Louis, is like a good place to invest. We don't need to give away our tax base to incentivize people to come here. Like we can set the bar higher.
And I can also say, just personally, as a St. Louis transplant, I love this city as well, and think that there's a lot of good things happening here, and a lot of people who are really proud of this city and proud to be from St. Louis. And so, it's been cool to see kind of some of the developments happening over recent years.
It's underrated. It's so underrated.
Yeah. Here's a good question. So other than WashU and SLU, who are the other large nonprofit landholders? Someone mentioned, BJC, the city's LRA holding a large amount of parcels that don't pay taxes. So is that?
Yeah, I would think in terms of like the purposes of this talk, it's the medical centers.
Yeah.
Someone mentions Rankin, and I need to learn more about Rankin. But yeah, I would say mostly it's the larger universities and the larger medical centers.
You might have saw this question, Molly, but as a faculty member at WashU, what are you doing to challenge the university's refusal to pay pilot?
I'm doing this.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm talking about it. I've had a conversation on the inside, when I'm on committees for this and that over the years, I'll raise this issue and it hasn't gotten much traction. But it is true. Like, this is my answer, is that I'm doing this. I'm trying to help people who care understand what's possible. And this is not a pipe dream. This is not something that is like a radical idea or that's never been figured out in other places. A lot of cities, it is unusual that our wealthiest institutions are not contributing to our school district. That is unusual. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to say that, and also to create, hopefully, some partnership between our city and schools and these mega nonprofits, so that we have a vision that will, come to fruition and that will outlast any particular leader. But we need some real structural change. We need to house all of our students. So, I focused on the school budget, but not all of the pilots wouldn't necessarily need to flow just through the school budget. It's, if we wanted to, for instance, create new affordable housing, we could, again, have a democratic conversation around how these monies should flow. But there is no shortcut to the housing crisis. It is just absolutely unacceptable that we have more than 4,000 students who are unhoused or insecurely housed. And oh my gosh, at our school, I could not go on long enough about how much I love our principal, our teachers, our social worker, our family and community specialists. Like, I love our school. And no one, you could be the most gifted teacher on this planet, no one can compensate for a student being homeless. Like, they need safe, healthy, affordable housing. So the services are all important, and I'm really grateful for the Office of Students in Transition. They do so much. And we need new housing opportunities for all our students, all our families.
You had the example of just where other institutions are kind of, contributing to funding for public schools. And then there was a question about whether or not you know who organized the advocacy specifically in Philadelphia around nonprofits contributing to public schools.
Yeah, it was a coalition, just like it's a coalition here. And part of the backbone of that coalition was Pennsylvania Jobs with Justice. And you might recognize that name, those of us who are here in St. Louis, because we have Missouri Jobs with Justice here. That's a really powerful organization that's doing really wonderful work. They're also a practicum site. And so definitely those of us who are talking about this issue of mega nonprofits making payments in lieu of taxes or pilots, we are not trying to recreate the wheel. We're trying to learn from campaigns like in Philadelphia, it was called Pen for Pilots, and learn and connect with what people were doing with, Jobs with Justice there. So yeah, we're definitely not trying to recreate the wheel, but more like take a page out of their book. If we need to, see what needs to happen to get it done.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's a question that's a little more geared toward, so for students who are thinking about coming here and wanting to do work, do practicum within St. Louis Public Schools, is there anything that St. Louis Public Schools can do to make it easier for students to do their practicum there?
I want to change that. Well, who's asking? Because I think maybe the question is there anything that we can do to make it easy for students to do practicum there? Within domestic, social, and economic development, I've pursued a little bit of funding to help to supplement the payment for practicum students. I really believe that all our students should be paid a living wage for their field work. But honestly, given everything I just said about the SLPS budget and all of our needs, I honestly think it's more on us to pay our students to go work with SLPS than them. But I would say just working with Dr. Deidre Thomas Murray, who heads the Office for Students in Transition. I mean, she's been I think a really tremendous partner. I had a student who I know well, was doing practicum with her and had a very positive experience. So I don't have anything that I would ask of them besides I just want to say thank you to them and, please, keep working with us because so far so good.
Well, there are many, many more questions in the chat, but I know we are reaching our time. And so I will just encourage those who did not get a question answered. You want to reach out to any of us, you can reach out to Molly, you can reach out to Brown Admissions, and we can get you connected. But thank you so much, Molly, for this really, really wonderful talk. And thank you everyone for being so engaged. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Sims now to close this out.
Great. I have just a couple more slides and updates to share with everybody. And while I'm doing that, Molly, there was one question. Could you say again the website that you shared at the very beginning that was kind of like where you could find similar data but in other US cities? Could you say that one more time?
So these I was talking about Good Jobs First is the name of the organization, and they're just about to release a report on St. Louis. But yeah, Good Jobs First is the organization.
Thank you so much. Okay, so hopefully the person who asked that is still on and heard that. All right, well, so just a reminder that you can view a recording and share that recording with colleagues that may have not been able to make it today on our website, and you can sign up for upcoming programs. The QR code and website is listed on the screen. I also put that in the chat. Our next program is an entirely different topic at the end of this month, January 30th. A faculty member here at Brown, Susan Stieritz, will be discussing sex chatting, tools for expanding sexual self-efficacy and teaching sex education. So I hope you all will consider signing up for that. And lastly, I just want to extend a special invitation for all of you to check out our free webinar programming for Black History Month coming up next month, February. We have 5 webinars in that series. And I dropped, again, a link in the chat to our Black History Month programming. These programs are also available on our Open Classroom website as well. So again, thank you everybody for joining today. Thank you, Molly Metzger, for sharing all of your work and your knowledge with us. And thank you, Sarah Lucan, for organizing